Sorry, is that to me? Hello, my name is Chris Bostock, and from 1980 to 1992, I was director of Tyne and Wear Theatre and Education Company. My first introduction to the building, in fact, to Newcastle, came back in the 70s, where I'd been working at the theatre in Harrogate in Yorkshire, and I came up to meet Michael Bogdanov, who was one of the directors here. And I remember meeting him in the foyer at the front of the theatre, which was at ground floor level, which is now Studio 3. And the whole place was laid out cafe style with red and white checked tablecloths, making a rather striking impression. It was very relaxed and very carefree compared to the stark nature of the brick surroundings which I met for the first time. I was working as an actor then, and my audition didn't work out. But the work that I was interested in was working with young people. The theatre in Newcastle had been thriving. But when the debts of £30,000 meant that the funding was withdrawn and the theatre was closed, it was occupied by actors, and it was a regularly reported event in the Stage newspaper. And it was one of the first theatre occupations that had happened, and just showed the commitment to the work that local artists, actors, directors, writers actually had, not only to theatre but to the playhouse theatre as it was. It became a shell, it became an empty shell. And during the time of occupation it was made more so, and when it was liberated again or funded again, there were no lights and there were no costume in store. It was the time when the Conservative government put money into inner cities and the metropolitan counties were formed. The metropolitan county of Tyne and Wear represented North and South Tyneside, Gateshead and Newcastle, and inner city money was discovered in order to create projects which would enliven and enrich the area. Money was created to restore the theatre, which was to serve the region. So the proposal for the Tyne and Wear Theatre Company was created. John Blackmore, with his administrator Nick Jones, were appointed. It is said that during his interview to set the whole company up, that Don Robson, who was the director of the finance committee, had under his table a piece of paper which he scored £10,000 off the amount of subsidy he would give if there was an answer given which he didn't particularly like. The theatre was set up, but the Playhouse wasn't in a fit state to operate at the moment, so the company was initially based in Sunderland at the Empire Theatre. There were small rooms off there, and the idea was to put product into all the major theatres around the region. At that time, and in the years to follow, there were many other small theatre companies around the region. Brothers Theatre Company, set up by the remarkable Mike Mould, who had worked with the Playhouse Company before. There was Skin and Bones, there was NE1, there were many small companies which were flourishing in the community. And they were worried when the proposal came to create a company that would actually come and work in schools. The funding came from the inner city partnership money, and separate to the work which the Tyne and Wear Theatre were going to do, this was going to be a free service to schools in the region. It was in fact no threat to anything that anyone else was doing, and we all worked together very well. There was a great appetite for theatre, as there still is to this day. Northern Stage, as it became known, I remember the board meeting when it was a variety of names were being discussed, as opposed to being the Tyne and Wear Theatre Company performing at the Playhouse Theatre. Everybody knew it as the Playhouse because it was on the map and it was in people's thinking as well. And various other names were proposed, from the A1 Theatre Company, I remember, and the Northern Stage. And it was Councillor Stan Heatley from Sunderland who just leant forward and said, "Do we need the?" They all agreed, no, it was just to be Northern Stage. The company was having a hard time in the theatre, variably, because the theatre space, being as wide as it is, demands extremely skillful design work. It's not the ideal acoustic building, but it does exist, and it has existed, and it's created great pride, not only for the profession, but also for the region as well. John Blackmore, in his time, did put on several big productions, particularly at Christmas, and he got Ken Hill to come and direct a lot of those Christmas productions. He'd worked with Joan Littlewood, and he knew his stuff. He put on big shows, and that was one reason why one of the other projects which my Theatre and Education company developed, created another type of production later. Northern Stage, the building itself was owned by the university, and it was maintained on a peppercorn rent of £1 a year, which meant that the bursar from the university came to attend board meetings, which had representatives from all the different regions of the area, 99% of which were all Labour councillors, with one representative of the Conservative Party sitting on the board. And I'm afraid the poor man, who was a very gentle ex-headmaster, was roundly set on by one of the Labour men one time when he had said something which was greatly disapproved of, and they gave him the local insult, "You're just £100 Tory," which echoed back a couple of generations. So if you wanted to be a member of the Tory party, you had to have at least £100 in your account. But for the most part, the pride which was shown in the potential of the theatre pushed it through. Having the bursar on the board was quite a useful thing, and on one season when business had not been very good at all, the university, for their own particular goods, had to create a barrier by the entrance in order to control parking within the environment. At that time, in front of the theatre, it was an open car park. They hadn't built the Student Union building then. So there was enough parking, but not during the day, because it got taken up. And Blackmore very skillfully used one board meeting to complain bitterly against the university for putting this barrier there, which created an insuperable barrier to many people potentially coming to the theatre, and therefore the season had not done well simply because of that barrier there being an insuperable problem to too many people who might have come, when in fact some of the productions were not quite as bright as they might have been. The particular pride that the theatre had was, that I observed, was in terms of using local writers and local actors in particular. At that time, of course, and still to this day, live theatre was putting on tremendous new writing down by the quayside with a very vibrant group of people. But it made a huge, huge difference to audiences and to the community when local events were put on. Tom Hadaway production, a production of Close the Coal House Door, which was seminal, and brought together the writings of Sid Chaplin and all the other people showing their huge pride in the history of the region. Slip back in time for just a moment. Before Tyne and Weir Theatre Company was built, the repertory theatre in Newcastle was down in Jesmondine, the Flora Robson Theatre. It was under threat, not just by the rats in the Dean, but the lorries coming chuntering down the hill through Jesmondine, which now the theatre and indeed the lorries don't exist because they trundle over a great big bypass. There was a touring company, Stagecoach, which did go around schools, run by the redoubtable Paddy Macefield, who'd set it up. He subsequently went on to work with at Oldham Theatre and do some remarkable work for disabled folks all across the country. He had created, in creating Stagecoach, a huge appetite in schools. This was nurtured also by the drama advisors in all the different regions around, in North Tyneside, Newcastle, Gateshead, Sunderland, and South Tyneside. And this was enhanced also by the work of the university. And the university in Newcastle had one of the most exciting lecturers in Dorothy Heathcote, who taught, inspired drama teachers, not just from this country, but literally from all over the world. And her counterpart in Durham was a man called Gavin Bolton, who was also a great writer. So when the Tyne and Wear Theatre and Education Company was being set up, we had on hand enthusiasm in the community, expertise in the drama advisors, and remarkable resources in the university of Dorothy and Gavin, but also in their students as well. Being set up as a free service to work only in inner city schools focused the attention of the company, and one of the first things we did was to set up a group of teachers to come and actually advise us. And they were red hot keen. The company, I should have mentioned, was initially set up by Roger Chapman, who John Blackmore leapt upon. Roger Chapman had set up the Leeds Theatre and Education Company before going to Australia, where he set up not only the Magpie Theatre Company, happy coincidence linking him to Newcastle, a company which toured right across Australia, but he also set up the Adelaide Festival and was a remarkable innovator. He left after a year to go and become the Northern Arts Drama Officer and asked me to take over. I had come up to be his assistant. He was the politician, he was the wheeler dealer, he was the man who knew how to speak to the people who had the money. I was interested in making the work. We had already drawn actors who had knowledge of working in schools, who had knowledge of education as well as performing, who had the ability to improvise. We had gathered writers, first-class writers, and there was a team of 13 people who were working, putting on product all year round. It was a remarkable resource. We were part of the Tyne and Wear Theatre Company. They were proud of us, and we were proud of them. The work continued to flourish, and we put on termly product for infants, junior, and secondary schools, product which ran for a whole term. Having observed the big Christmas shows which were going on the stage, and having observed the audience, the younger children in the audience were not coping. There were loud noises, there were blackouts, there were flashes, there were bangs. It was not appropriate. So I proposed, partly because I had on hand and working with me a first-rate writer and a first-rate musician, that we create programs of work for children under 5 in the Gulbenkian Studio Theatre. The Gulbenkian Studio Theatre, funded by the Gulbenkian Foundation, was a square box based on what the RSC had to use. The Royal Shakespeare Company used to come to Newcastle once a year. They came and put product into the Theatre Royal, into the Playhouse here, and also into the Gulbenkian Studio, because it matched exactly what they had back at Stratford. So their product could come in very, very easily. The argument was quite hard to win. I said that we would have the best writing and the best music, and it was suggested that I use some students to do the lighting. I absolutely refused to have any countenance for this, because that was in some way the most patronizing suggestion that children of a lesser age should be treated any less than any other person coming to the theatre. We created, alongside the work going around schools, programs of work which are still remembered to this day, production which involved the children actively, sets which were always transformative, multicultural performers who were multi-skilled, who were musicians as well, who came and performed for very young children and their families. We know it was a success because of the ways that it got quoted afterwards, the way it was imitated, and the way that several adults asked if they could come and see the shows without bringing their children once their children had left home. For over 10 years we put on those productions, and it was a remarkable leadership that we created across the country. I know there are other companies that are actually working for children under 5, and creating work which was age appropriate was not just to say this is your audience of the future, although of course it was, and of course it was the argument which the politicians would hear. It was serving those children and their families with a theatre product which would hopefully inspire them, not only to be audiences, but also to be dreamers, to set them on an appetite for theatre, on an appetite for wanting to grow artistically. The Theatre and Education Company moved from the Sunderland Empire space, where we'd been squeezed in, to the top floor of Blandford House, the museum, which was being developed at the time. It suited the Tyne and Wear committees for us to have us there because they were developing the space, and it also became an extremely useful performing area right there on the top floor, although our commitment was to the playhouse here. So we developed our ambitions, and we also created a series of plays being put on here at the last week of the summer term for top juniors and lower secondary children. Because, of course, our work was funded to be working just for the inner cities, all of those children who came were not allowed, according to our funding, to pay. So it was that in several cases, children were bought en masse on the metro. Children were bussed in, and in the case of more than 1 year, the children from the then Heaton Manor School were told not to report to school in the morning, but to report to the playhouse. The car park outside was awash with children. The theatre was packed with young children and their teachers. The idea of this would be something that a lot of people would have thought to be anarchic, dangerous, and difficult. I harnessed local writers to find something which had real interest for that particular age range, and we put on a series of shows here. One was Aggie's Dump, which was set on a rubbish tip. There were cars, and there were children scrambling over the rubbish tip here. Jag's Fair was actually set on the hoppings and was the story of a fairground family, with the first task actually building this booth that they were going to do. There was boxing on stage as well. We did an adaptation of a Quentin Blake book, Angelo. He came to visit the theatre as well. It was a story of tightrope walking. And I had an actor who was challenged, dared, and a great deal of prayers went up to see that he could learn to tightrope walk in 1 week. He did, he succeeded. And of those audiences who came, the most enthusiastic listeners were the teachers, who were seeing something which was age appropriate, which was celebrating theatre, which was enhancing all the work that they were doing in school for language, for discipline, for concentration, for excitement. And it created a wonderful habit in a great many people. The theatre has been adapted, the theatre has been changed, and so has the work which we were doing in the community. The Playhouse faced 2 big alterations while we were around, and on the first occasion it meant that we had to move out of here, and the company was based for a while at the Arts Centre on Westgate Road, and then the Creative Centre was in the Tyne Theatre. When Northern Stage were there, we moved in just after a great fire had taken place. The fire took place on Christmas Eve. A difficult time to get the fire engine out. The fire curtain was down in the theatre, and the only damage was on the stage. Several questions were asked about how this might have happened, But the Victorian stage machinery was damaged, and it was the carpenters from Northern Stage who moved in and actually recreated that theatre. It's my absolute shame that I never videoed the incredible work they did. They put on a production of Peter Pan there, and because there were various schemes of work being employed at the time, there were 24 people who were working backstage on that production, turning the great so-called Chinaman wheels, raising great platforms on the stage for another remarkable achievement, and actually restoring effectively the theatre and making that a possible event that could happen and a building brought back to life. The work continued in the community until Thatcher's government did not wish it to happen. The work that we were doing was provocative. It was intended to be provocative. It created the opportunity in children to learn and to question. The plays we did were written at the behest of teachers. The question we asked the teachers is, what can you not do well? What are you not resourced to do well? And very often we were told they're not being taught to think for themselves. We did an infant production, and it was about a bus journey. We built a bus. It was a metal frame, and the children on the bus hopped on, and they all had seats. They met the bus driver, and off they went on their journey. They met a young girl who was going to work. They met an old man who got on the bus. He was going to his allotment. And then they heard the conversations that were going on. The bus driver was going to lose her job. The inspector outside was giving her a very hard time. And the children on that bus had to decide what was going to be best for all the people involved. We put this proposal to our advisory committee, and Dorothy Heathcote, the drama specialist, said, "It's just like the cuckoo, isn't it?" And all the drama advisors looked at her and said, "What do you mean?" She said, "What you're doing is, you're giving these children an egg. You're saying, this is my special thing, now it's your responsibility to look after it." The children got off that bus and they went and spoke to the inspector. Unfortunate for them, his little office was around the side of the bus and only a few of them could get in at the same time. And they had to think what they were going to say and how they were going to say it and put their case, supporting the bus driver losing her job, the old man not being able to get to his allotment, and the girl getting to work. And the instruction to the inspector was to block them and to say, "No, that's it." So they had to go back and they had to rethink their arguments. If their arguments were cogent enough and clear enough, he would change his mind, but only after every child had had a chance to speak. On another occasion, a teacher said to us, "My children don't know what's happening in the world beyond the end of our street." We met together and we started to dream and plan and scheme, one of the most important parts of our work in theatre and education. And somebody came up with the idea of Fight for the Forest, a book by a fellow called Chico Mendes. He was a rubber prospector in Brazil, and he'd been shot by people who wanted to take his land. It's a well-documented story. We told the story of Chico. We sent information to the schools in advance. We had an education liaison officer who prepared teaching information for teachers. There were maps on the wall, there were pictures of the rainforest all around. And they were told they were going to have a visit from a fellow called Chico. Chico arrived in their classroom and said he was a rubber tapper and he'd like children of the classroom to come and meet his family. "Oh, but," he said, "you'll need a land right document first. You must take this with you." So the children were all given a piece of paper which was their land right document, which was incredibly important. When they got to the hall, there were cut-out trees all around and a small hut. And in the hut there was a family. A girl was very busy. She was going to the town. She was listening to her pop music. And one by one, the family had an interchange, and then they all went off and left. The children were left in the hall. the doors suddenly burst open, and in walked a white-suited man in a Stetson hat with an American accent who came and he said his name was Mac Berger and he was interested in buying some land around here. Did anybody have a land right document? And in exchange for those land right documents, and he offered very many inducements like televisions, roads, bicycles. Of course, this was attractive, and there were always a few children who would take up the offer. Those children were taken off to a classroom and were given a slideshow about the benefits of the future and what he could offer them and what he would do with the land. He would be able to cut down the forest and he would be able to graze cattle and they would be able to share in his profits. Back in the hall, Chico and his family came home and realized that there were some people missing and realized that this was really important. And they looked on the map where those people who had gone, which bits of the forest would be cut down. And then the Chico and his family had to ask everybody there what they would do if it was their situation. The children decided to fight and defend the forest. So when the others came back, they had to decide what they'd do themselves. They stood with their backs to the trees to protect them. They joined their hands. They were told that in the afternoon a government minister would come to discuss their situation. Stage manager was dressed up in a suit. Children were laid out very carefully in seats, and procedure was going to be explained very carefully as how they would proceed with the government minister. There was to be no calling out, there was to be waiting in turn, there should be polite comments. And the actors were there with their prepared statements which they had to make. The first 2 or 3 performances went well, but there was something that was lacking. I went home and I turned on the radio. And I listened to Today in Parliament. There they were, sitting on either sides, listening to each other for a short while, but then interrupting rapidly. I went back to the actors the next morning and I said, quickly, for the second half, throw out the script. You don't wait for your turn to speak, you speak when you want to speak. And the children picked up on that, and just like a wildfire, they were followed by all the children finding their voice, of having their say, of speaking up for the forest, of speaking up for a Brazilian rubber tapper, because they knew what it mattered. It mattered not only to the environment, it mattered to those characters which they knew. Those children in those classes had entered into a drama which they had some pre-information about, they had some knowledge which mattered and they cared about it, and they expressed their care within a creative form. It mattered. Theatre mattered. They grew better. But the government didn't want that sort of work going on. They didn't want work like production Labour for the Lord, which was written by Phil Woods, a local writer who went on to work for Coronation Street. The story was about a Victorian factory. They needed work for the children. We put up benches in the school hall, and the children were set to crushing crystals. It was quite a setup. There was a very large stage cloth to sweep up the mess afterwards. While they were busy doing their work, the young man who was their friend, who was helping to set them up, was being heard to be told that he was going to lose his job and that his conditions were going to be made even harsher all around him. It was awful. The grand lady who owned the factory came wandering around in her very smart Victorian dress, and the children, overhearing everything, were the ones who then had to take responsibility for the lives of the people around them. They were the advisors. They were the experts. In a secondary school, we did a play called Sex, Lies and Tricky Bits. It was the time when AIDS was on the agenda and people were afraid to talk about it. We sat the audience on 3 sides, close enough to touch the actors in some cases, of a young couple testing out their relationship. The set was a bed. There was a blanket on the bed. There was some cuddling. There was some giggling. But there was a lot of understanding afterwards, because the characters came and sat down. And the characters were there to be interviewed by everybody in the audience. Practice which has been copied by many other training situations ever since. The plays, the theatre and education production were put on, could only be done by people who had a real commitment to theatre, to children, and to education. It's to our great shame that this work doesn't go on anymore. It's to my great shame that the legacy that we created in so many ears and eyes and hearts doesn't have the funding anymore. It's been squeezed out. It's not been seen to be important. Those children who saw it and grew with it haven't yet been able to find their voice, to be able to resurrect something which made them grow. I know, and I've seen those people who've come to the theatre have their lives transformed. There was a young man who watched one of our plays, which was set at the time of a Nazi development and the brown shirts. And there was a young man who came and wanted to discuss with one of the actors his emergent sexuality, which he'd not been able to do with his parents or his teachers before because of something which he engaged with in a play. There are people who came and saw work that we were doing with the under fives, saw the work that we're doing with puppets who've gone off and formed their own companies. The actors who worked with us have gone on to express themselves in so many other different forms. I was particularly proud when, on more than one occasion, an actor came to the company and said, "Well, I'm a local person, I've been and done my training, where's my job?" And in the case of the Theatre and Education Company, it wasn't just me, the whole company had to decide who they wanted to have work with them. If it had been the case that of those people who sat and dreamed and created the company to this day, they'd still be here turning over. As it happens, one of the legacies is that many of those people who work with the company are still living and working in the area. Many of the people came and settled. And doesn't it always happen that when people come and bloom and grow, that they put their roots down in this area, and they do grow in different ways. But time moves on. And many of those people who were our audiences are now teachers themselves, our parents themselves. And I know that they've been influenced, and I hope that the influence that they've received from theatre goes on being part of their legacy for many years to come.
So sorry, can we just stop the change backwards?
Are we doing all right?
Yeah, brilliant.
So we're just doing the stream of consciousness bit. Have you got some particular questions you want to ask? I can't hear a word, darling.